Before smartphones, before grocery stores, before even the idea of electricity, there was survival. Not in theory, but in blood, bone, and blistered hands. In the heart of the medieval world. People didn't just live, they endured, and the strange part, some of their forgotten survival techniques, maybe the very thing we need now, more than ever. The sun had not yet risen over the frost-covered village, and the world was silent except for the distant caw of a raven perched atop the chapel roof. The air hung heavy with the biting cold of early winter. In the dim light of the hearth, a woman named Ellsworth stirred slowly beneath the weight of her woolen cloak. Her cottage was small, shaped from timber and packed earth, the roof thatched, thick with straw and reeds gathered from the riverbanks in autumn. Outside, the ground was frozen, but inside, the last of last night's fire still glowed faintly beneath the gray and crumbling remains of charred wood, ash to the modern eye. It would be a mess, something to clean, to discard, to sweep out, with disgust. But to Ellsworth, and to every soul in the village who knew what it meant to live through cruel winters and scarce seasons, that ash was more valuable than silver. It was not the end of something. It was the beginning. She rose from her cot, her joints aching from days of bending and lifting, her knees creaking from decades of labor. She tied her long hair back, brushed snowflakes off the windowsill with the hem of her dress, and stepped toward the hearth with a small clay bowl in hand. Gently, with the reverence of someone retrieving sacred relics, she scooped up the fine, warm ash. Her fingers worked deftly, sorting out the bits of unburned wood and dropping them back into the fire pit. What she needed was the fine powder, the purest part of what the fire had left behind. Ellsworth wasn't just preparing to clean. She was preparing to protect her family. Soap, as we know it today, did not exist in her time. There were no perfumed bars, no industrially produced cleansers. But Ellsworth had learned long ago, at her mother's knee, how to turn the remnants of fire into a substance that could scrub away disease and filth. It was a skill passed down through the women of her bloodline, through famine, plague, war, and storm. She poured warm water through a cloth sack filled with ash, letting it drip slowly into a wooden basin beneath. As the water filtered through, it pulled with it the soul of the ash, potassium carbonate. The clear liquid that emerged was lye dangerous in the wrong hands, miraculous in the right ones. Nearby, in a pot hanging above the rekindled fire, she added the lye to a pan of melted fat, the thick white tallow she had rendered from pigs weeks before. Stirring slowly with a wooden paddle worn smooth from years of use, she watched the two substances merge and begin to transform. The smell was sharp, unfamiliar by modern standards, but to her it was the scent of safety. The lye and the fat thickened into a creamy paste. This was soap rough, basic, but life-saving. She thought back to the years when plagues swept through the land. She had watched children waste away with fevers, seen wounds fester for lack of simple cleanliness. She remembered when her youngest had gashed his leg on a nail while chasing chickens. Infection had set in within a day. Ellsworth had no doctor, but she had ash. She boiled water, cleaned the wound with her harsh soap, then packed it with a paste. Of ash and honey, the swelling stopped. The color returned to his cheeks. He lived. There were countless stories like that, quiet victories won not with swords or prayers, but with ancient knowledge and simple tools. Ash, when handled with care, was not a symbol of loss. It was life. And in winter, when the land gave nothing and the world outside turned cold and hostile, it became even more essential. In a corner of the cottage, covered jars of grain sat protected beneath layers of ash. Ellsworth had stored them this way since the harvest, knowing that mice, beetles, and mold could not penetrate the dry, alkaline dust. It was a trick her grandmother had taught her, one she once thought foolish until the year the grain went bad and they nearly starved. Now she trusted the ash more than she trusted the skies. She also stored her eggs in it. A barrel in the corner held dozens of them, each one cushioned in ash, shielded from air and time. It was said they could last the entire winter this way, and they often did. The villagers laughed at those who doubted it until they needed food, and found none in their own stores. In spring and summer, ash was still useful. It was spread into the gardens to sweeten the soil, particularly in plots where the cabbage and onions grew. In smaller quantities, it discouraged slugs and beetles. If someone burned themselves at the fire or scraped their skin climbing through brambles, a poultice of ash and vinegar could draw out infection. Mixed with vinegar or honey, ash became a kind of medicine. There were rituals too. Not magical ones, practical. After a woman sleeping in circles, the community warmth method in a world without heaters, survival was found in the closeness of others. Snow fell steadily over the village, soft as feathers and relentless as time. The roofs had vanished beneath white drifts. Trees stood like frozen sentinels, black limbs outstretched against a sky heavy with gray. It was the second week of deep winter, a time when the sun rose late and set early, casting only a few meager hours of light across the land before darkness returned like a wolf to its den. In a long house built from hand-hewn timbers and sealed. With daub and moss, 20 souls huddled together in silence. The fire in the hearth glowed low and red, more ember than flame, its warmth unable to reach the furthest corners of the hall. Smoke drifted lazily toward the rafters, weaving among herbs that hung there to dry sage, mugwort, and yarrow, their scents mingling with the musk of wool and old wood. A small boy, no more than 5 winters old, shifted in his sleep. His face, round and pale, peeked out from under layers of linen and sheepskin. He pressed closer to the warm body beside him, his older sister, who stirred only slightly and draped an arm around his back. Around them, the rest of the family lay like stones, in a river shaped by the flow of warmth, forming a circle without ever meaning to. This was not a coincidence. It was not comfort. It was survival. The villagers had no stoves, no central heat, no electric blankets humming through the night. What they had was each other and the understanding, passed down through generations, that closeness meant life. To sleep alone in such winters was foolish, even fatal. No one questioned it. No one resisted. Whether family, friend, or even passing stranger, bodies were brought together when the cold came. Edric, the head of the household, was always the last to sleep and the first to wake. A broad-shouldered man with a scar beneath one eye and a stiff limp in his left leg, he moved slowly but with purpose. He sat beside the hearth and stirred the embers gently, feeding them with small sticks and breath, coaxing them back into flame. The warmth would not last long, but it was enough for now. Behind him, the sleeping ring held fast. It began with the youngest at the center, infants wrapped in swaddling, nestled in their mother's arms. Around them, older children formed a protective shell, then the women and elders. The outer ring was reserved for the strongest, the men, the warriors, the ones who could endure the bitter edge of night. This method, though never written, was sacred. It was taught in practice. A child who once tried to sleep on their own had nearly died from exposure, even inside the house. Since then, no one dared question the circle. It wasn't merely about warmth, it was about balance. The young gave off heat but could not maintain it. The old needed warmth but gave little of it. The men on the edge bore the brunt of the cold, but they did so proudly, knowing that their place in the circle meant safety for those within. Sometimes, new mothers and their babies were placed in smaller rings of 3 or 4, cocooned in extra hides, shielded from drafts. The warmth of the circle was like the beating heart of the home, and every limb, every breath, contributed to its pulse. There were rules, unspoken but enforced by time and necessity. No one turned their back to the ring unless it was to face the wall and block the wind. No one brought wet clothes into the bed, and no one broke the circle without cause. To do so was to break trust, to endanger others, to put comfort above survival. Children were taught these things as early as they could speak, and even those too young to understand obeyed instinctively, drawn to the warmth and rhythm of shared sleep. Outside, the storm deepened. Snow pressed against the door, whistled through the gaps in the shutters. The wind made the longhouse groan, timbers creaking like old bones. Inside, though, the air was still thick with breath, quiet with dreams. There was something ancient about it, all something primal. In the circle, there were no titles. A chieftain and a servant slept shoulder to shoulder. A hunter and a weaver shared the same fur. Bodies, stripped of roles and pride, became equal in the face of cold. There was no status in the dark, only warmth or death. And so they slept night after night in that same formation. It was not comfortable by modern standards. Elbows poked ribs, feet brushed faces. Coughs echoed through the dark, but it worked. And that was all that mattered. Edric, returning to the circle, lay down on the outer rim and pulled a hide over his shoulders. The cold bit at his back, but he did not complain. He had stood in frozen fields. He had fought in snows so deep they swallowed men whole. This was nothing. What mattered was the life in the middle, the children breathing softly, the mothers sleeping deeply, the fire still flickering in the hearth. In the morning, they would rise stiff and sore. Some would have frost on their eyelashes, but they would rise. Long ago, Edric's grandfather had told him a story. During a winter so fierce it turned the river to stone and killed half the animals in the woods, a lone man refused to sleep with his kin. He felt it weak. He chose pride over close. Salt, more than just flavor, the invisible line between feast and famine, rot and preservation, life and slow decay. Drawn by salt, there was a time in the village when the sea was spoken of only in tales. It lay far to the west beyond forests, over hills, past lands where no villager had ever walked. To most, it was just a story, a place of endless water where ships floated like leaves and salt hung in the air thick as smoke. But for one man in the village, salt was not just a tale from a distant shore. It was a matter of life and death. His name was Thane, and though he had never seen the sea, he carried it within his satchel in small cloth pouches tied tightly with cord. Salt, precious, sacred and heavy with the weight of survival. Thane was a salt runner. Each autumn, when the harvests were stored and the air began to turn sharp with frost, he set out on foot with 2 oxen, a cart laden with barley and dried flax, and enough firewood to last 10 days. His destination was a coastal market nearly 30 miles away. It was a dangerous journey, bandits, wolves, snowstorms, but if he succeeded, he would return with the most vital substance a village could possess. Not gold, not iron. Salt. Because in the medieval world, flavor was the least of salt's powers. In the cold months that followed the last harvest, meat was slaughtered in bulk. Pigs, chickens, sometimes cattle animals that couldn't be fed through the lean season. Their deaths were practical, not cruel. Their lives honored through use. But once butchered, their meat had to last. There were no ice boxes, no freezers, no preservatives in sealed plastic. There was only salt. As soon as Thane returned from his long trek, the village gathered at the curing shed, a structure of rough-hewn logs with gaps near the roof to let out smoke. On great slabs of stone, the fresh meat was laid out. Salt, rough and white like crushed bones, was packed thick into every cut. It entered wounds, clung to fat, and burrowed into the muscle. The salt drew out the blood. It dried the flesh. It stopped rot in its tracks. What wasn't salted was smoked. But even smoked meat required a base layer of salt. Without it, the fire only delayed the inevitable decay. With it, the food could last not just weeks, but months. Sometimes, if stored, right, even a year. This knowledge was so old that none remembered who taught it first. It was simply known, passed not through books, but from hand to hand, from generation to generation. Salt cured meat. Salt saved grain. Salt preserved life, and it wasn't just meat. Cabbages were buried in salt layers and pressed into barrels. Fish were brined until they turned firm and white. Even herbs, the ones most prized for healing, were soaked in salted water to protect them from mold. But it was not just a substance. It was a currency. Thane did not always trade for salt with barley. In bad years, he gave cloth. In worse years, leather. But the hardest years were those when he had to trade people's labor or promises. A week of carpentry. A month of weaving. Even a year of wool from all the village sheep. Salt could cost a village its comfort, but it would repay them in survival. In this world. A sack of salt could equal a life saved in January. A salted ham meant a mother could feed her child during a storm. A salted fish meant an old man might live to see spring. There were rituals too. Every family had a salt box. Carved from oak, sealed with wax, it was kept near the hearth or in a cool part of the house. It was opened with reverence, never carelessly. No one wasted salt. Children were scolded for touching it without cause. Dropping it was considered bad luck, not because of superstition, but because of reality. If a winter's worth of salt was spilled, it might mean hunger before thaw. Newlyweds were given salt as part of their dowry. When a baby was born, a pinch of salt was placed under its pillow, not for mysticism, but to keep insects away and draw out damp. Salt was folded into bandages and pressed into wounds to stop the spread of infection. It burned terribly. The pain was sharp, electric, but it saved more limbs than it lost. Even in death, salt had its place. If a villager died in deep winter, when the ground was too hard to bury the body, salt was used to delay the rot. The body, wrapped in wool and packed with salt, could wait in the cold room until spring thawed the graveyard. It was not beautiful, but it was respectful. It was human. Thane once saved a boy's life with salt. It was the middle of February. The firewood was low, and the meat stores had grown soft with mold. The boy, barely 9, had eaten from a pot left too long by the hearth. He grew sick, quickly vomiting, fever, pale skin. The fire that walks, the cool trick in the bitter stillness of winter, when fire meant the difference between life and death. There existed a secret known only to those who listened closely to the silence of Ashdod. It began, as many things end. The village did, with the cold. Not the gentle chill of early autumn, nor the sharp bite of a sudden frost, but the kind of cold that came with winter's deepest hour. The kind that killed without malice. The kind that moved through stone walls, crept beneath wool, and turned breath to ice. It was the season the villagers called Bone Month, and they met it with dread and resolve in equal measure. In the long house of the elder woman Mirwen, where 6 generations had passed through the same timber-bird doorway, the hearth was the heart of the home. It gave light, it gave warmth, it gave life. But what many did not realize, what only the oldest and wisest among them knew, was that fire could be made to last far longer than flamed out fire could walk. And the villagers called this secret this coal trick. The sun had set hours ago, but sleep did not come easily in Bone Month. The wind howled like a wounded beast through the thatched roofs and twisted boughs of the sleeping forest. Mirwen sat by the hearth, hunched in her thickest woolen cloak, poking gently at the glowing bed of coals with an iron rod. There was no flame left, only heat. A living glow beneath the gray veil of Ashdod. It would be enough. With slow, practiced Hands, she scooped the hottest coals into a clay pot lined with dampened ash and moss. This was the hearth pot, darkened with age and cracked at the rim, passed down from her grandmother's grandmother. She covered the embers gently with more ash, just enough to suffocate the oxygen, but not enough to smother the heat. Then she placed a thick, round wooden lid over the pot and tied it shut with leather THONG. The pot would still be warm. The coals inside would still breathe, like the final pulse of a sleeping giant. And from that breath, they could awaken a fire once more. The young ones did not believe it at first. They had seen fire born of flint and steel, heard the striking crack of stone, and watched the dry kindling catch. But they did not know how to carry fire, not in wind, nor storm, nor silence. They thought that fire died when it vanished, but fire, as Mirwin knew, never truly died. It only slept. When she was a girl, she'd watched her father bury the embers. Each night, under a thick blanket of ash, she'd asked him, wide-eyed and curious, "Why do we not let it burn?" And he had smiled, placing a soot-streaked hand on her head, because a fire that sleeps will still wake, but a fire that spent all its strength cannot. That was the lesson, Dot, when the cold grew cruelest, when the wind knocked shutters loose, and snow drifted through the cracks. The villagers banked their fires before sleep. They flattened the glowing coals, spread a layer of ash across them like a burial shroud, and let them slumber through the dark hours. No flame remained, no smoke rose. But in the morning, with a whisper and a breath, the heat would return. Sometimes, fire was needed elsewhere, at the hunting hut, the lambing shed, the far-field shelter. There was no time to strike flint, no patience for wet wood. So the villagers turned to their old trick. They carried fire in pots, wrapped in furs. Nestled in ash, the embers survived even the longest journeys, Dot. It was called walking the fire. It was done with reverence, never haste. You could not drop it. You could not let it breathe too freely. You had to feed it just enough to keep it alive, but never enough to let it escape. If it grew too bold, the pot would crack. If it grew too cold, the coal would die. Fire was not to be controlled. It was to be coaxed. There was one winter when the trick saved the entire village. The storm came without warning, like a cloak dropped over the world. For 3 days, snow fell so heavy it erased paths, buried doors, silenced the birds. The wind uprooted trees. The river froze over in a single night. And worst of all, the main longhouse fire went out. The wood was damp. The flint was lost. Panic set in like frostbite. Children cried. The old shivered. Breath clouded in the air. Even inside, but Mirwin, then barely 16, remembered the hearth pot. She dug it from under a bench, where it had sat, half forgotten, half myth. It was warm, not hot, not glowing, but warm. She took it, with hands trembling from cold and fear, and carried it to the hearth. She laid down dry moss, broken twigs, and pine resin. She whispered to the pot, as if to a sleeping child. And when she opened it, there it was, the spark. A coal, still alive. Within minutes, flame had returned. By nightfall, the fire roared. They said afterwards that Mirwin had magic in her blood. She laughed at that. "It's not magic," she told them. "It's memory. Fire remembers if you treat it kindly." In the years that followed, the coal trick became a rite of passage. Young ones were taught how to bank the fire, how to test the coals without stirring them too soon. They learned to smell the ash, to feel the heat through thick cloth, to judge when a coal was truly dead and when it only seemed so. It was as delicate as midwifery, as sacred as prayer. There were accidents, of course. Once, a boy too eager cracked a pot by overfeeding the coal. Another girl, frightened of letting the ember die, kept too many coals alive and burned her. The fat of the land, tallow, grease, and survival, it was neither gold nor grain that kept death at bay in the heart of winter. It was fat, humble, hidden and holy, long before the snow came, before the wind began to howl and the earth hardened. Like stone, the people of the village began to prepare for what they called the leaning dark, the long night of winter, when the light faded early and nothing grew, not even Hope Dot, and in those days before the cold set in, the fat was gathered, not in sacks, not in barrels like salt or grain, but in wooden tubs and hanging bladders and clay pots sealed with beeswax. Fat was life, and those who knew how to render, store, and stretch it were often those whose fires still burned when February knocked Dot. No one understood this better than Brenda's. The village fat mistress, she had a crooked spine from stirring pots that were too heavy for her frame, and her fingers were burned and scarred from years of rendering. But Brenda's held more knowledge than the entire parish combined. Not of prayers or scripture, but of survival. Her cottage always smelled faintly of boiled lard, and her shelves sagged beneath the weight of earthen crocks filled with yellowish, waxy substance, tallow, the fat that fed the village Dot. It was she who decided how the autumn slaughters were used. Not the chieftain, not the blacksmith, Brenda's, because meat fed for a week, but fat could save for months. The rendering pit was deep and lined with stone, placed just beyond the smokehouse where the air always carried the scent of burning, juniper and drying flesh. When the pigs were butchered, nothing was wasted, not the intestines, not the feet, and certainly not the fatty trimmings. These were hauled to Brenda's pit in heavy baskets, where a cauldron hung over a low, constant flame. Dot she stirred with a great oaken paddle. She added nothing but time. The fire turned slow, never high, lest the fat scorch. Over hours, sometimes a whole day, the fat melted into clear liquid, bubbling gently, giving off a rich and savory perfume that clung to the skin and hair of every soul who came near. When cooled, it solidified into something smooth and creamy tallow if from cattle or sheep, lard if from pigs. Dot, this was no luxury. It was the cornerstone of winter. Dot tallow fed fires in a way that wood could not. Dot in small clay cups. Brenda's poured the warm fat around thick cords of woven flax or twisted moss. These were her fat lamps, and when the sun failed to rise for more than a few hours, they glowed in every home. A single spoonful of fat could burn for hours, throwing dancing shadows on the cottage walls while children listened to stories, spinning yarn and chewing dried meat. Candles were rare, expensive, and often hoarded for church rites or weddings. But tallow lights, those were for the people. Crude, yes, they smoked. They sputtered, but they gave light, and in Bone Month, light was hope. But fat did more than light. The night. Dot it filled bellies when nothing else could. When the flour ran low, when the beans were gone, when the salted meat had turned, Brenda's brought out the dripping pot. Into a bowl of boiled oats or barley, she stirred a knob of lard or tallow. It melted into the grains, coating them with richness, turning a thin gruel into something warming, something nourishing. Children grew on that food. Men survived on it. Women found strength in it during the birthing of winter children, and when sickness came, and it always came in winter, fat became medicine. Brenda's would melt lard with herbs, thyme, chamomile, yarrow, and rub it onto aching joints, chests heavy with cough, or cracked skin bleeding from the frost. It sealed wounds, softened skin, and held warmth against the bone. Old Jitha, the midwife, once told of a newborn born, blue and silent in the heart of January. Brenda's had wrapped the babe in linen soaked with warm tallow and pressed it close. To the hearth, the child had screamed moments later. Lard had brought life back. Even weapons were oiled with fat. The blacksmith kept a pot of sheep grease near the forge. Axes, knives, arrowheads, each one rubbed with tallow before being wrapped. For the winter, without it, the iron rusted, warped, or cracked. Boots were rubbed with lard to keep them watertight. Gloves, too. and the ropes that tied down hay bundles were coated in grease to keep them from freezing. Stiff in sleet and wind, nothing was wasted, was a saying in the village. Dung and dirt, fuel when wood ran out, when the forests were bare and the firewood gone. The desperate turned not to trees, but to the earth, and the beasts thought it had been 3 weeks since the last cartload of firewood reached the village. Road from the forest was buried under a deep crust of ice, and the oxen refused to go further. Axes, dulled and chipped from splitting frozen trunks, now hung useless in the blacksmith's shed. Even the brushwood once gathered by children with baskets and laughter had vanished beneath the drifted snow and silence. The firewood was gone, and still the wind blew Dodd at the edge of the village. Where the land met the moor, an old man named Ethelric stood in the doorway of his sod-roofed home. He was thin as a reed, hunched like a bow, with hands so callous they no longer felt the cold. His fingers clutched a bundle of dried brown discs, each roughly the size of a small plate. To the unfamiliar eye, they looked like cakes of hardened mud. They were not mud. They were dung bricks, and they were all that kept the flames alive. Now, Ethelric had lived through 60 winters. He had seen the deep freeze of 1173, the famine of the hard moon, the storm that killed 23 souls. In a single night, he knew better than to rely only on trees for warmth. Trees fell, axes broke, roads closed, but animals? Animals stayed, and animals made dung. From cow to goat to sheep to donkey. Every beast left behind a gift unwanted, overlooked, but vital. Ethelric had learned from his father and his father's father that dung was fire if you knew how to use it. In the autumn months, before the first frost, he would walk the grazing fields with a flat spade. Fresh dung was useless, wet, foul-smelling, impossible to burn. But once dried in the sun for days, sometimes weeks, it turned hard and fibrous. Like peat, it held heat and resisted wind. It didn't burn as brightly as wood, but it smoldered long and steady, perfect for warming stones or baking bread. He collected it all: cow pats, sheep droppings, even the occasional dried horse waste. From travelers, the villagers laughed at him at first. Children pinched their noses when he passed. Women whispered that his home stank like the old compost heap behind the chapel, but when January came and the wood was gone, they knocked on his door. The fire in Ethelric's hearth was low but alive. He laid a brick of dried cow dung onto the coals. It hissed softly, then glowed. Smoke curled up, not the sharp, choking smoke of green wood, but a mild, earthy smell, like moss after rain. The warmth it gave was deep, slow, and enduring. He added a second brick, then pulled a pot of barley and root from the hook above the flames. Dinner. It wasn't just about heating food or warming toes. Dung was also used to bake. In the leanest years, he had taught the village women how to heat flat stones with dung embers. They would knead oatcakes and press them against the hot stone. The dung smoldered beneath, the bread cooked above. No set, no ash, just warmth. But dung was only one part of the secret. The other was earth itself. When the wind howled too strong and there was no fuel, left no dung, no wood, no straw, Ethelric turned to peat. That ancient soil, half-formed and half-forgotten, cut from the wetlands in great bricks during the autumn and left to dry. Peat was the slow fire. It could not be lit easily, but once caught, it burned like a buried sun, low, deep, constant. He would cut it with a long-bladed iron spade, stack the bricks like bread loaves, and leave them to cure in the wind. By winter, they were ready. Some said the earth remembered the warmth of ancient forests, that inside every peat brick was the ghost of a tree, compressed by centuries of rain and moss. Ethelric didn't believe in ghosts, but when he watched the flames lick up from a peat hearth, he did wonder what stories the soil had swallowed. One year, a neighboring village ran out of wood entirely. No dung had been stored. The snow kept coming, and soon people began to freeze in their beds. The priest rode to Etheric's door and begged. Etheric said nothing. He simply walked behind his house and showed him the mound, a wide, low stack of dung bricks and peat covered in hide to keep it dry. Enough to warm 10 families for 10 days. He gave half of it away, not because he was generous, but because he knew a fire shared is a fire preserved. That winter, no one died. Dung wasn't only fuel, it was insulation, Etheric taught the young ones to pack sheep dung mixed with mud and straw into the gaps between wall boards. When it dried, it formed a crude plaster that sealed out drafts. In the roof, it was used to fill cracks. On the floor, it was laid beneath straw mats to hold heat. Even bricks could be made of it. He remembered once helping a family rebuild their lean-to with sun-dried blocks of clay, grass, and cow dung. It stood for 10 years before smoke and shadows, preserving with fire long before the clock, the calendar, or the ice house. There was only smoke. And with it came memory, mastery, and survival. The first snow came early that year, before the last apples had been picked, before the roots had all been pulled, before the pigs had been butchered. It was a cruel wind that swept down from the hills, carrying the breath of winter like a curse across the valley. By morning, a silver frost clung to every surface, roofs, trees, boots left outside overnight. Fires burned from dawn till dusk, and yet the chill persisted. Wood smoke curled from every chimney in the village, coiling into the cold sky like long, gray fingers reaching for warmth that wasn't coming. It was the kind of winter that came with warnings. And the villagers listened. Not with fear, but with urgency. In the center of the village, where the stone circle stood and the cattle pens lay close, there was a small hut, low and wide, with a roof that never stopped leaking smoke. Some called it the meat house. Others knew it by its older name, the smoke hall. And for one woman, Ildra, daughter of the tanner, granddaughter of the war widow, it was sacred ground. Ildra was not a priest, though her hands held more ritual than most clerics. She did not wear robes, but her apron was always stained with ash and blood. Her tools were not crosses or censers, but hooks, knives, cords, and coals. She was a smoker, one of the few in the valley who still remembered how to preserve with fire. To the untrained eye, her hut looked like any other outbuilding. Timber, walls, earthen floor, patched thatch roof. But inside, it was a different world. Smoke hung heavy in the air. It moved like a ghost, rising from the fire pit in the center and wrapping around everything it touched: pork haunches, trout strung in pairs, long strips of venison. Even bundles of herbs hung from the beams. Every beam, every rafter, every nail soaked in the wisdom of smoke. It began, always, with the fire. Not a blaze, never that. A true smoker's fire was humble, slow burning, dampened with green wood or soaked bark, fed not with flame, but with smolder. Alder, oak, and birch were favorites. Pine was dangerous, too resinous, too bitter. Willow was good for fish. Applewood gave a sweetness to pork. Everything depended on what was being preserved. Ldra could smell a fire and tell if it was too hot. She could run her hand through the smoke and know if the meat would cure or rot. She added juniper berries sometimes, or crushed rosemary to the coals, her own secret for flavor. Though she never admitted it aloud. Fire was not her tool. It was her companion. Before smoke, there was salt. Every cut of meat was rubbed with coarse briner packed in salt for days. It wasn't just for flavor, it was preparation. Salt pulled the blood, the moisture, the death from the flesh. Only once it was dry and firm did the smoking begin. Ildra laid the meat on grades of woven hazel branches high above the coals. Some pieces hung on hooks driven deep into the blackened beams. Others were skewered on rods and laid across the rafters. The fire burned low for hours, days, sometimes weeks. Each day, she rotated the meat, turned it, tapped it with her fingers to test the firmness. pressed her nose close to test for rot or mildew. She never spoke during these moments. Smoke work was sacred. You did not curse. You did not whistle. You did not speak lies, because smoke listened. And it remembered. The village once mocked Ildra. They called her Coal Maiden and Soot Witch. They laughed when her face darkened with ash and her hair smelled of meat and fire. But when the floods came and the larders filled with rot, when the merchant wagons failed to arrive with dried meats, when the rats found the granaries, it was her hut that fed the people. They lined up in the snow for strips of smoked lamb, for fish stiff and cured and strong-smelling, for blackened sausages and hard hams tied with cloth. The children called it shadow meat, and they loved it. That no one mocked her after that. Smoke was more than just preservation. It was protection. The meat that hung in Ildra's hut did not spoil. It could last through a whole winter through frost, thaw, even damp. It was hard, yes. Sometimes bitter, sometimes tough as leather, but it was clean. It was safe. And that made all the difference. A family with smoked food didn't just survive, they thrived. There were secrets. Of course, secrets no one taught, only learned by breathing the same smoke for years. Like how to wrap meat in cheesecloth, to keep flies off in summer. Or how to string trout mouth to tail, so that they dried without curling. How to rub goose fat into smoked duck to soften the chew. How to place pots of vinegar around the smoking room to absorb excess moisture. How to use smoke to dry healing herbs, not just food, thyme, sage, rosemary, so their oils lingered for months. Some herbs, Ildra claimed, only revealed their true strength after the smoke passed through them. Once, a hunter brought her a full stag. He asked her to smoke the entire clay pots and earth ovens, cooking with stone and soil before iron cauldrons and chimneyed hearths. Before cast iron stoves and cookbooks, there was only earth. And from earth, they made fire. From fire, they made bread. And from bread, they built survival. The morning frost had not yet melted when Ildred began to dig. He had chosen the spot, carefully on the south side of the slope, shielded from the biting wind, near the stream where the clay was richest. His breath hung thick in the air, and the dampness in his boots spoke of frozen ground slowly softening. The village's wood was nearly gone, and the flint stones had dulled with too many strikes. If they were to keep eating through the last lean month, they would have to go back, not to the forests, not to the iron cauldrons now cracked from years of smoke, but to the ground beneath their feet. To the earth oven. EALD or ED was not a cook. He was no butcher, no baker, and no great warrior, but he was a rememberer, one of the few who kept alive the old ways, passed through whispers rather than ink. His grandmother had taught him how to build a baking pit from clay and stone when he was just a boy. She called it hearthcraft, the oldest kind of cookery, older even than the spoken word. Now, as the world stiffened under the weight of late winter, he returned to that memory. He knelt, hands gnarled and raw, and began to dig a shallow bowl into the soil. The earth oven was a marvel of simplicity. A hole, some clay, a bit of stone, and time. He layered the pit's bottom with rounded river rocks, chosen for their ability to hold heat without cracking. Then came the clay dug from the riverbank, kneaded with straw, horsehair, and water until it formed a thick, sticky paste. He shaped it into bricks and set them along the edges of the pit, smoothing them with a wet hand and sealing the gaps with more mud. By the time the sun touched the treetops, the oven had taken shape, a half dome of earth and stone, open at the top with a hollow that echoed slightly when tapped. He let it sit for 2 days, drying gently under a linen cloth. Then he stoked a fire inside, slow and careful, letting the clay harden not by flame, but by breath. Smoke curled upward, and the oven coughed as if waking from a long sleep. It was ready. In those days, food meant fire, but cooking meant cleverness. You could not always trust the pots. Clay cracked. Iron was precious and rare. Hanging kettles tipped or rusted, but the earth oven was steady, faithful, ancient. Villagers brought Yildred what they had: a bowl of barley, soaked overnight in water, 2 carrots, soft and thin from the cellar, a haunch of smoked hare, still, streaked with fat, dried wild onions from the year before, and bread dough. Always Doe.Ealdre took the dough first. He buried it in hot ash left from the fire, covered it with a clay lid, and let it sit. Around it, he stacked warmed stones and sealed the oven with a thatch-wrapped turf block. No air, no flame. Just trapped heat. Hours later, when you unsealed the oven, the bread had bloomed brown, round, and crusted uneven but fragrant, like the scent of dusk in a rye field. They tore it apart while still hot, steam rising in clouds, and passed it around in silence. This was bread born of earth, and it tasted like life. Soon, others asked him to build more: a smaller pit oven for the shepherd's hut, a clay ring stove for boiling root stew, a heated stone chamber for drying beans, warming porridge, even brewing mead. He taught them all how to dig with the curve of the sun, how to build the dome with fingers wet in clay, how to dry slowly lest the walls crack, how to bake not with fire but with what fire leaves behind. Flame is fast, he'd say, but heat is wise. It wasn't just about baking. Earth ovens were used for preserving. Meat wrapped in wild garlic leaves and packed in clay could be roasted whole. The clay hardened, cracked, and peeled away, leaving behind flesh so tender it could be torn with. Fingers, the earth trapped the juices, the steam, the essence. Fish were wrapped in moss, stuffed with herbs, and laid in the pit with glowing stones and peat smoke. Turnips were cored and filled with goose fat and breadcrumbs, sealed with clay, and buried beneath coals until soft as marrow. Even eggs were cooked in ash, slow roasted until the yolk turned golden and sweet. And when the village had nothing, no meat, no barley, only a bowl of roots and some dried berries, Yildred showed them the secret of stone water wisdom, finding, carrying, and purifying in the wild, before wells were deep and buckets were iron, before pipes and taps and holy fountains. There was only the land, and those who knew its secrets knew life. They called her Anwen of the Hollow, though no one remembered why. She lived beyond the edges of the village, in a moss-covered hut tucked between the folds of an ancient ravine, where trees leaned close and the air smelled of damp bark and fern. Children whispered she could find water where none flowed. Hunters swore she could smell a spring from half a mile. Others said she was mad, wild, strange. But when the rivers slowed to trickles in the heat of drought, when the snow melted too soon and the wells turned foul, it was Anwen they came to, and she always found water. It wasn't sorcery. It wasn't magic. It was memory. She walked the land the way a seamstress traced stitches in an old tunic, familiar, gentle, precise. Her feet knew where moss grew thickest. Her fingers knew how to press the bark of birch trees and feel the thrum of moisture beneath. She listened, not with ears, but with her skin. The land spoke, and water always left signs. If you knew how to read them, it began, always, with the birds. When the sun rose too fast and the wind brought no rain, Anwen would watch the skies. Birds did not fly far from water, especially at dawn and dusk. Pigeons and doves never strayed more than a few furlongs from a drink. Finches, warblers, tiny things with dry songs, could be followed to shallow pools. She watched the flight paths. Where they dipped, where they circled, where they vanished beneath the canopy. That was where water slept. Then came the trees. Willows never grew far from streams. Alders soaked their roots in soaked ground. Even ash trees, tall, proud, stoic, grew thickest where the soil remembered rain. Anwen would walk barefoot, toes pressing into moss and loam, and when she stepped on dampness that lingered through noon heat, she would kneel, Not to pray, to listen. With her hand on the soil, her cheek to the moss, she could feel the quiet thrum beneath the buried veins of the earth. Where water ran in secret, there was a spring once hidden in the crook of two rocks behind her home. No stream marked its path. No moss betrayed its flow. But every summer, when the rest of the land turned to dust, the stone would weep. Tiny beads of moisture would form in the shaded cracks. She showed it to no one. That was her source, her secret, but she taught the others how to find their own. Collecting water was a different art entirely. When no stream flowed and no spring showed, you learned to take water where you could, from dew gathered with woolen claws spread on grass at dawn. The villagers once laughed when Anwen showed them a bucket filled by nothing but wet rags wrung dry before sunrise. But when the drought reached its peak and the cisterns ran empty, they remembered, from trees, tapped gently with bone awls in. Springtime, collecting sap so sweet it doubled as food. Birch and maple were best. A slow drip, caught in a hollow gourd or a folded leaf. It wasn't much, but it was clean from rain when it came. She showed them how to line their thatched roofs with curd bark troughs and hang skins to catch the fall. Rain barrels were just for gardens. In the worst months, they were for life and from earth itself. She once dug a pit in the driest corner of the field, lined it with leaves, and waited. Within a day, a puddle appeared, murky, clouded, but real. You don't drink it raw, she warned and they didn't, because water may quench thirst, but it also brings death. If taken unwisely, purification was the hidden half of watercraft. Clear water wasn't always clean, and the dirtiest puddle could be made safe with time and fire. Anwen's fire never roared. It smoked low and long, burning elderwood and alder, fed slowly with bark. Over it, she boiled water in clay pots so blackened with use they looked like stone. 3 full rolls of the boil, she said. 1 for the worms, 1 for the sickness, 1 for the spirits. Then she strained it through charcoal crushed into fine ash and packed into layered cloth. Sometimes she added dried mint or juniper to sweeten the taste. Other times she dropped in a heated stone drawn from the fire to kill what the flame could not. And when firewood was low, she turned to the old ways. She knew of solar water leaving a skin of clear water under the sun, tied tight with linen and weighted with rock. Over days, the sun's rays would clean what heat could not. Slow, but pure, as she taught the value of settling. If you had no fire and no sun, you waited. Let the water sit, let the dirt fall. Let the sickness drift to the bottom. Then drink. From the top, with care. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than dying. She crafted carriers 2 water skins from goat stomach, sewn tight with flax thread and sealed with beeswax. Gourds hollowed and dried, slung on cords. Clay flasks with wax-sappered mouths. Children learned to carry water like messages close to the chest, steady and quiet. A spill was not clumsiness. It was waste, and waste was sin in Bone Month. Village had once sent a hunting party into the forest, chasing wild boar. They packed meat, salt, weapons, but no water, thinking the streams would be enough. The streams had dried. They returned. Animal intuition, reading creatures for survival in the same immersive, storytelling rich tone and extended length, minimum 9,500 characters. You've requested for the Forgotten Medieval Survival Techniques series. I'll return shortly with the full chapter. Please sit tight, the story is coming alive. You said, yes, ChatGPT said, thank you for your patience. Here is Chapter 10, Animal Intuition, reading creatures for survival in a time before weather forecasts, before compasses, before ink scratched maps across parchment. There were the beasts. They knew where to go, what to fear, when to run, and those who watched them survived. The villagers knew how to read tracks in snow. They knew a wolf print from a dog's, knew when a deer was walking and when it had bolted in panic. They could follow blood droplets across a field or scat through brush like lines in a holy book. But there was only one who truly understood the creatures. His name was Wolfgar, though many just called him the Listener. He didn't speak often, and when he did, it was low and deliberate. His words came out like thawed honey, slow, heavy, valuable. He lived at the far edge of the woodlands, in a hut made of sod and pine poles, with no fence to keep animals out and no smoke curling from his hearth. Because Wolfgar didn't fight the wild, he listened to it, and it spoke through animals. He had once been a soldier, broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, fast with a spear. But something had happened in the wars beyond the river. He came back with a deep scar down his left cheek and a silence he carried like a shield. After that, he stopped attending the market, stopped drinking meat at the longhouse. Instead, he followed the birds. The first time the village sought his help was during a hard winter. The herds were thinning. Traps came up empty. The forest had grown too still, too silent, and the men feared a famine. Wolfgar had not been seen in weeks. Until one morning, a trail of deer hooves led from the edge of the field straight to his hut. They followed, and found meat drying on racks, enough to feed a dozen. They asked him how. He only said, "The birds told me." They thought him mad. Until he explained. Not with words, but with signs. He led them through the forest and pointed at a single blackbird perched near a birch tree. It cawed, hopped twice, and flew east. "Follow it," Wolfgar whispered. They did, and within half a mile, they came to a clearing full of deer droppings and old beds pressed into the snow. The flock had followed the herd, staying close for warmth, for insects, for scraps. Where birds lingered, prey wasn't far. The village had forgotten, but Wolfgar had not. He taught them to watch the crows. Crows were scouts, curious, clever. They circled over death. If you saw 3 crows flying low and circling, meat was near fresh kill or carrion. If the crows perched high and silent, danger stalked below. Wolves, sometimes men, he taught them to read rabbits. If rabbits froze in the open, ears flat, body trembling, it wasn't from cold, it was fear. Something moved in the underbrush. A stoat, a hawk, or worse. He taught them the silence of dogs, when their hackles rose and they stared into darkness with no sound. That meant spirits, or a stranger. Dogs bark at foxes, but they go quiet for what they cannot understand. 1. Spring, a child went missing. The men searched the creek, the woods, the steep trails behind the hills. It was Wolfgar who found her. He followed bees. He noticed they flew not toward flowers, but toward still air. Unnatural. He said bees avoided storm-broken branches and shadowed hollows, unless something else drew them. They led him to a ravine, where the child had fallen, her arm broken, cradled in moss. Bees had found the sweetness of her bleeding hand. Wolfgar carried her home, and the village stopped calling him mad. Animals knew the weather. If birds flew low, wings heavy with humidity, a storm was coming. If cows refused to graze and huddled close to the barn walls, snow was near. When frogs went silent and the night insects ceased their chorus, the air would crack with lightning within a day. Wolfgar taught them how the horses stamped and snorted when the ground trembled long before men felt the quake. How goats sought high ground when the river swelled. How squirrels stored food deep in their dens if a harsh winter crept close. Not superstition, observation. Animals lived in truth. They did not argue. They did not lie. They simply reacted. And Wolfgar paid attention. He had a fox once. Not a pet, but a partner. A red vixen with one blind eye, who came and went as she pleased. She never let him touch her, that slept near his hearth and brought him scraps feathers, mice, even the foot of a weasel once. She'd vanish for days, then return, always before frost. She would scratch at his door twice, then sit and stare at the tree line. That meant snow, every time. He named her Bone, Horn, and Sinew, tools from the hunting, a world before steel was common. Before anvils rang with blacksmith's hammer, there was bone. There was horn, there was sinew. And in these, there was survival. The hunt did not end with death. Was the first lesson Osric had learned when he was but a boy, his hands still too small to hold a spear steady, and his eyes too wide to stare into blood without trembling. His father, Harwold the Limper, had killed a stag that morning, a great beast with a rack like a fallen tree and eyes clouded with age. The spear had pierced its side, clean and true, and the men sang as they dragged the body back to the edge of the forest. Osric expected the feast instead. He was handed a knife and told, "You'll clean it, not just the meat, the bone." The sinew. The horn because to waste them was to offend the land itself. Osric's people lived in a time of scarcity. Iron was rare, traded over long roads by men with narrow eyes and high tongues. Bronze bent too easily, and wood broke in the cold. But animals, those roamed freely, and they gave more than flesh. They gave structure. After the meat had been stripped and the organs pulled for salting, the real work began. Osric's father showed him how to peel sinew from the spine and limbs, long, glistening threads of tendon, tough and translucent. They were dried over ash or hung from rafters, then pounded between stones until they frayed like fiber. These threads would bind bowstrings, wrap knife handles, stitch leather, tie arrowheads, stronger than flax, more flexible than gut. Sinew was the wild's thread, and every hunter learned to save it before the flies came. Then came the bones. They were not thrown away or buried. They were shaped. The leg bones of deer made excellent chisels. The shoulder blades, once scraped clean and boiled, could be honed into scrapers and spades. The ribs were shaped into fish hooks, thin and curved. Even bird bones, hollow and light, were used for flutes, for needles, for drinking straws and icy broths. Osric's uncle once made an entire fishing spear out of boar bone and ash. The tip was carved from a femur. Split into 3 barbed prongs. It lasted 2 winters. The skull held power, too. Some used it for ritual, painting it with ochre, hanging it over the door to guard against famine. Others boiled it, ground it, and mixed the powder with pitch to harden glue or treat wounds. Even teeth had use, threaded into necklaces, sewn into coats, ground into charms. They reminded the living what it meant to survive. But the real art, the ancient, revered craft, was in horn. It did not rot like bone. It did not splinter like wood. Horn bent when heated, held shape when cooled, and sharpened to a deadly edge when carved with care. The long horns of aurochs, the great wild cattle that once roamed freely, were prized beyond measure. Osric remembered the one time he saw a full set taken from a bull that had killed 2 men before it fell. The horn was as long as a man's arm, black and ridged, and thick enough to use as a cup or sheath. He helped his father soak it in boiling water, then press it in a frame until it flattened like bark. When cooled, they carved it into a bow back, layered with sinew and fastened with hide glue. It snapped with power, faster than any you wood alone could manage. Horn's power. Even smaller horns, goat, sheep, roe deer were used. They made buttons, cone teeth, and spoon handles. They became powder flasks and signal trumpets. Heated and scraped thin, horn could even be made into windows' translucent shields to keep wind and rain out of candlelight. Osric's mother had a lantern made of horn shavings, bound in brass wire and wax. She called it moon trapped in a cage, and she was right. It glowed like one, the sinews that held animals together, tendons. Cartilage, cords of strength were not just for crafting. They were studied. Understood. Used to imitate nature. Osric learned to build traps from twisted sinew that sprang with the force of a fox's jaws. He made snare lines that could pull a bird from the sky or a rabbit from a run. He even learned to repair boots by threading sinew into holes and wrapping the edges with fat-soaked leather. Stronger than thread, more weatherproof than hemp. And when his own bowstring snapped one cold morning on a failed hunt, he remembered how his father once carried a spare, wound tightly in a horn flask and soaked in tallow. He used it. Took down a buck that same day. Bones were also messages when a wolf was killed near the village. Its skull was staked on the trail, not just to ward off its kin, but to warn men. The path was dangerous. The beasts had teeth. Sometimes Osric etched runes into thigh bones and left them in forest shrines as offerings. Sometimes he left a bone knife at a cairn, asking for luck. Other times he carried finger bones in his pouch, tiny, light, worn, smooth with worry. They belonged to his brother. Lost in a snowstorm as a child, that was the way of their people. Grief made tools of memory. There were days when all the village had were bones. No harvest, no bread, no trade, but they could fish with bone hooks, could sew hides into cloaks, could scrape bark into flour, could fix sled runners with horn pins and fletch arrows with sinew. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. Gut, hide, and bark. The carriers of the old world before cloth was spun, before carts groaned under wheels, before barrels and sacks. There were the carriers of the old world woven by hand, shaped by instinct and tested by generations. These were the vessels of survival. There was a time before leather sacks and stitched pouches, before knotted satchels and linen slings. A time when a person's ability to carry food, fire, water, medicine, even hope meant the difference between living through the winter or vanishing in it. And in those days, there were 3 gifts that bore the burden of a life in the wild: gut, hide, and bark. She was known as Brindis the Binder, and the story said she could wrap a stone in birch bark so tightly it would keep dry through a storm, or weave a strip of elk gut into a pouch that could hold boiling broth without leaking. No one knew exactly how old she was. Her eyes were pale, her hands thick with the calluses of 1,000 needles. Her hut sat at the forest's edge, low and round like a turned bowl, and always smelled of smoked hide and pine glue. The children said she spoke to trees. The elders said she listened to animals. But what everyone agreed was this: if you needed something to carry your life, you went to Brindis. Get the intestines of purpose. The first time young Kiel was brought to her, his hands were blistered. He'd tried boiling water in a leather sack beside the fire, and the whole thing had burst. Brindis handed him a coiled length of gut, pale and slick, and told him to rinse it in stream water and stretch it across a U-hoop. He stared, confused. She didn't explain. So he followed her instruction, washed the gut until the smell faded, stretched it until it dried, and watched as it hardened into a membrane tougher than linen, yet light as a feather. This, she said, can carry the fire's breath. And it did. That hoop became the base of a water bladder, sealed with wax and capped with a wooden plug. It held boiled broth, wine, even rendered fat, without cracking or leaking. Gut was more than a cast-off from butchering. It was survival silk, harvested from elk, deer, goat, and even fish. With enough care, it became bowstrings, both strong, and elastic, waterproof linings for pouches, thread for closing wounds, and hides lantern sheaths that glowed like moonlight. She once made a parchment scroll from sheep gut so thin it could be rolled into the mouth of a drinking horn. When unwrapped, it revealed runes inscribed in pine soot and tallow ink words that lasted longer than memory. Hide The skin that endured to work with hide was to wrestle with time. A fresh hide stank. It steamed when peeled from muscle. Flies came before the knife finished its work. But Brindis taught that only fools rush the process. Hide must be scraped, stretched, soaked in brain or lye, then smoked slowly. Only then did it become leather, the second carrier. Hide was not just for boots and coats. It was the backbone of transport. The men carried. Water skins sewn from goat or pig stomachs, sealed with resin food satchels made from the belly hides of deer, soft and pliable medicine wraps, lined with beeswax used to carry moss, honey, or healing roots. Brindis had a sack made from moose neck hide, thick and oil rubbed, that had crossed the mountains 3 times without cracking. It could be dragged through snow, soaked in a stream, even dropped from a ledge, and it would not. She taught the women to cut hide to its purpose, thinner for folding, thicker for weight. Cowhide was strong, but stiff. Roe deer hide was delicate for pouch linings or flute wraps. Otter skin, waxed with fat, made the best fire kits, keeping embers warm and dry, even in the rain. And rawhide soaked, flattened, and dried became. Baskets, shields, drums, even armor, once. When wolves came in the night and the gate was split, it was Brindis who lashed rawhide across the gap. It held for 2 days until help came. Bark, the forest's basket, but it was bark that the forest gave freely. The villagers thought of bark as fuel, kindling, mulch, useless, but to Brindis, bark was the skin of the earth, and she treated it with reverence. In spring, when the sap ran high and the trunks were pliable, she would slice vertical seams into birch trees and peel the bark in sheets, never more than a hand's width, never from young trees. Always facing east, she set the morning sun soft in the fibers. Birch bark, when fresh, was like cloth, flexible, fragrant, resistant to water. She folded it into cups, quivers, food trays, and document rolls. When dried, it hardened into a light, nearly fireproof shell. Other trees had their uses. Elm bark, soaked and woven into rope. Linden bark, pounded into soft strips for slings and wraps. Cedar bark, fluffed and used as tinder or padding. Brindis once made a traveling basket, entirely from pine bark, stitched with sinew. It carried dried berries and fished 30 miles without rot. Another time, she stitched together bark and hide to create a cradle wrap, light, warm, and resistant to wind. Even when all else failed, bark carried fire. She showed the hunters how to wrap. Embers and birch curls and dry moss, carry them through snow, and rekindle them hours later. They called it sun in a pouch. The binder's wisdom. Brindis didn't just craft, she taught, but she never used diagrams. She made students learn by feel. Wet bark lies, she'd say, so feel it when it's dry. Gut stretches like breath too tight and it snaps. Hide has memory. Treat it cruelly and it will shrink in fear. And they listened because her creations endured. When storms came and wooden crates swelled, her bark containers stayed sealed. When food spoiled in cloth, her hide satchels kept it safe. When clay pots shattered, her gut bladders held the last. Broth. Even the stiff-necked village headman begged for one of her fire bags, lined with beeswax and dye. The memory of the wild before the pages of books were turned. The land was read with hands. Before maps, men followed animal paths. Before machines and markets, there was instinct. And in those forgotten techniques, there was wisdom. They say, the old ways are dead. That survival now comes in vacuum-packed bags, not bundles of bark. That medicine lives in bottles, not roots. That comfort is bought, not earned, but the land remembers, and so do those who choose to listen. Across these chapters, we followed the silent footsteps of people who did not name themselves survivors, because survival was not a badge then. It was breath. It was every day. It was life, stripped to its sharpest edge. We met Anwin of the Hollow, who taught Water's voice through moss and birdsong. We followed Wolfgar the Listener, who read the winds and howling wolves and crouching. Dear Dot, we stood beside Osric the Bonekeeper, crafting memory from sinew and horn. We watched Brindis the Binder bend gut, hide, and bark into tools of endurance. And in each of them, we saw not just technique, but trust. Trust in nature's signs. Trust in hands to build. Trust in time-tested. Truth that held even when the world trembled. These were not myths. They were people. People who made fire from fungus, rope from root, light from fat, medicine from ash, shelter from earth. People who stitched their hunger into traps and their sorrow into bone flutes. People who walked through snow without panic because they knew the snow, knew the land, knew themselves. They did not waste. They did not rush. They lived close to the earth, not above it. Today, many of these techniques lie buried beneath centuries of progress. But they are not lost. They sleep in the bark, in the wind, in the still moments between dawn and duty. And in you. Because somewhere deep, older than memory, your hands remember. The world has changed, but nature has not forgotten us. And if you listen, you'll remember too. Asterisk if you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, please like, subscribe, and share our YouTube channel, Sleep Story Room. Your support helps. Use continue creating good content to inform and inspire y'all. Thanks for watching, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video. Very informative video. Stay blessed.